The night of March 23, 1945, found the Rhine transformed into something that would reshape the entire future of warfare. At 2100 hours, along the western bank near Wesel, Germany, an officer named Oberfuhrer Helmsteinberg raised binoculars to his eyes and watched the darkening waters below. His hands trembled slightly as he scanned the river, making notes in a leather-bound field notebook. These observations would eventually end up among the captured German documents discovered at Army Group H headquarters after the battle concluded. The Americans had finally reached what Germany considered its sacred river, but surely, Helmsteinberg thought, they could never cross it. No army in recorded history had successfully forced the Rhine when facing determined German defenders with intact fortifications. He'd seen something through the gathering twilight that reinforced everything German military doctrine had taught him over 3 years of war. Artillery flashes erupted repeatedly across the western bank, thousands upon thousands of guns massing in the darkness. What Helmsteinberg observed was the beginning of what German commanders had been expecting all along, a traditional river assault that would take days to prepare, requiring fixed bridges, vulnerable crossing points that his 88mm guns would systematically destroy one by one. The Rhine had protected German territory for 2,000 years. Even now, with the Reich collapsing under pressure from east and west, German military engineers assured their commanders that the river's 1,300-foot width and powerful currents made crossing without extensive engineering preparations virtually impossible. 2,000 soldiers from the 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion Black Watch prepared to do something that would have seemed insane just hours before. They weren't waiting for traditional assault boats to shuttle back and forth under withering fire. They weren't standing around while engineers struggled to construct pontoon bridges under artillery bombardment. Instead, they were about to climb aboard strange-looking truck vehicles that German intelligence had catastrophically misunderstood. These were DUKWs, amphibious vessels that had been observed in Normandy and Italy but dismissed by German analysts as nothing more than specialized beach landing equipment. What German commanders didn't realize was that American industrial capability was about to transform their supposedly impenetrable water barrier into something that resembled a highway for Allied armor. The collapse of German defenses had actually begun months earlier in the intelligence departments, where analysis after analysis had missed the critical truth. Oberstleutnant Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would later admit to Allied interrogators how fundamentally German intelligence had misread American amphibious capabilities. Reports had come in from Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy describing these swimming trucks. But German intelligence officers had filed them away as curiosities of American abundance, lumped together with other strangeness like ice cream ships and Coca-Cola supply units. Among the men defending the Rhine was Major Hans-Georg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model, serving with the 1st Parachute Army. His personal diary, captured when he surrendered in April 1945, revealed how German thinking had ossified. The most experienced officers, men who had studied river operations from classical times through recent conflicts, believed they understood the unchangeable rules of amphibious assault. Attackers needed overwhelming artillery superiority, specialized bridging equipment, and most importantly, time to establish crossing points that defenders could then target with concentrated fire. But captured intelligence documents told a different story about German awareness. Captain Friedrich Wenzel, an intelligence officer with the 15th Army, had compiled reports on Allied equipment that mentioned the DUKW exactly 3 times over 6 months of documentation. Each reference dismissed the vehicles as coastal landing craft, completely irrelevant to river warfare. The reports estimated the Americans possessed perhaps 50 to 100 such vehicles in the entire European theater. The reality was almost incomprehensible in scale. By March 1945, over 2,000 DUKWs operated across the European theater. The U.S. Army had organized them into specialized amphibious truck companies, each unit containing 50 vehicles with fully trained crews. These units had practiced river-crossing operations since the Normandy landings, developing tactical doctrines that German intelligence agencies had completely failed to detect. The British had received 2,000 additional DUKWs through Lend-Lease agreements, adding their own operational innovations. Canadian forces operated 800 units equipped with specialized cold weather modifications. The entire DUKW program represented American problem-solving at its most pragmatic and efficient. The origin story began back in April 1942, when a Coast Guard patrol boat ran aground on a sandbar near Provincetown, Massachusetts. Conventional trucks simply couldn't reach it through the surf and soft sand. This seemingly minor incident sparked a revolution in amphibious warfare that would ultimately contribute to the destruction of the Third Reich. Palmer Costello and Rod Stevens Jr., working with engineer Dennis Pullerston for the Office of Scientific Research and Development, imagined a truck that could transition seamlessly between land and water operations. When Ford Motor Company rejected the proposal as technically impossible to complete on schedule, General Motors Corporation stepped forward and accepted the challenge on April 23, 1942. The engineering team at GMC's Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan worked around the clock 7 days a week. By June 2, 1942, just 38 days later, the first prototype rolled off the assembly line. The vehicle combined a standard GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck chassis with a watertight hull designed by Sparkman and Stevens, renowned yacht architects. The designation DUKW came from GMC's nomenclature system: D for the 1942 design year, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. The vehicle's true genius lay in several critical innovations. Frank Spear from GMC's engineering division developed the central tire inflation system, the world's first implementation of this technology, allowing drivers to adjust tire pressure while the vehicle was moving. At 10 to 12 pounds per square inch, the tires spread wide for maximum traction in sand and mud. At 40 to 45 psi, they provided efficient highway performance. A 25-inch propeller driven through the transfer case connected to the main transmission provided water propulsion at 5.5 knots, while a rudder linked to the steering wheel allowed seamless navigation transitions from water to land. Major General Jacob Devers observed the first demonstration in June 1942 and immediately ordered mass production. The initial contract specified 2,000 units. By war's end, GMC had manufactured 21,147 DUKWs at an unprecedented production pace of 525 vehicles monthly during peak periods. Each cost $10,750, roughly equivalent to 7 Jeeps, but possessed capabilities that would prove invaluable. By March 1945, German leadership faced a strategic reality that commanders refused to acknowledge even to themselves. General Alfred Schlemm's 1st Parachute Army, the most effective German force remaining in the West, had been nearly destroyed through intense fighting, losing 90,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The reinforcements arriving to defend the Rhine consisted of Volkssturm units, elderly men and boys with just weeks of training, armed with captured weapons and wearing armbands instead of proper uniforms. Feldwebel Otto Kraus of the 180th Infantry Division, positioned near Wesel, wrote his wife on March 20th, expressing confidence in German defensive capabilities. The Americans sat across from them now, thousands of them, their vehicles audible day and night. Yet the Rhine protected Germany. Even Napoleon had failed to cross the Rhine against opposition, Kraus wrote. Engineers had destroyed every bridge, and German artillery had registered every possible crossing point. The defensive preparations looked formidable on paper. Since September 1944, over 200,000 civilian laborers had been conscripted to strengthen West Wall fortifications and extend them toward the Rhine. 3,000 concrete bunkers and gun positions had been constructed or reinforced. The river itself provided what German defensive doctrine called the perfect water obstacle: too wide for assault bridges, too swift for boats, too deep for fording. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had assumed command in the West after von Rundstedt's dismissal, issued orders that revealed fundamental German assumptions. The enemy will require 48 to 72 hours to establish viable bridgeheads after initial crossings. His directive stated, "This window provides opportunity for counterattack with our mobile reserves." These mobile reserves consisted of 47 Panzer Corps with approximately 150 operational armored vehicles, tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers combined, to cover a front of nearly 200 miles. But the most critical German failure was conceptual rather than material. Wehrmacht doctrine, refined through 5 years of war, understood river crossings as sequential operations. Suppress defenders with artillery, send infantry across in assault boats, establish small bridgeheads, begin bridge construction under fire, reinforce gradually as more bridges were completed, then finally send armor across. Each phase provided defenders opportunities to concentrate their fire and launch coordinated counterattacks. Unknown to German intelligence, the Allies had assembled the largest concentration of amphibious vehicles in history along the Rhine's western bank. By March 22, 1945, hundreds of DUKWs had been positioned in concealed areas within 5 miles of planned crossing points. Each vehicle had been waterproofed, mechanically inspected, and loaded with carefully calculated cargo manifests designed to maintain proper water stability. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, commanding the 458th Amphibious Truck Company, recalled the meticulous preparation in detail. "This wasn't Normandy with tides and beach obstacles," he explained. "The Rhine presented different challenges, managing current, identifying exit points, coordinating with artillery to avoid friendly fire." His crews had practiced on the Maas River for 2 weeks, learning how DUKWs handled in fast-flowing currents. The vehicles themselves had been modified through 3 years of combat experience. Armor plating protected drivers and vital mechanical components. Ring mounts for 50-caliber machine guns provided self-defense capability. Most critically, specialized water pumps could handle small arms fire penetrating the hull, allowing DUKWs to continue operating even when their wooden hulls were perforated. Captain James Mitchell of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company described the final briefing before the operation. Command had told them something extraordinary. They were going to accomplish what nobody had ever attempted. They would use DUKWs as the primary assault vehicle for a major river crossing. Not support vessels, not supply carriers to follow after bridges were built, but the actual assault spearhead. Each DUKW would carry a full rifle squad with equipment, cross the Rhine, drive up the eastern bank, and deposit troops directly into combat positions under fire. British forces brought their own amphibious assets to the operation. The 79th Armoured Division, under Major General Percy Hobart, had assembled 600 LVT-4 Buffalo amphibious tractors, each capable of carrying 30 men. These would work alongside the American DUKWs in what would become the largest amphibious river crossing in military history. Yet it was the DUKWs, with their ability to transition seamlessly from water to land operations, that would prove most destructive to German assumptions about how river warfare functioned. At 1700 hours on March 23, 1945, the greatest artillery bombardment of the Rhine campaign commenced. Over 4,000 Allied guns, ranging from 25-pounders to 240mm howitzers, unleashed a 4-hour barrage that seemed to transform the air itself into a solid substance of steel and explosive force. German observers reported that the eastern bank appeared to be boiling beneath thousands of shells impacting per minute. Gefreiter Heinrich Müller, manning an observation post near Wesel, attempted to count the muzzle flashes across the river. He stopped at 500. It resembled a solid line of flame stretching north and south beyond the limits of vision. The noise transcended individual explosions. It became one continuous roar that made coherent thought nearly impossible. Under cover of this bombardment and absolute darkness, the 1st DUKWs entered the Rhine at 2100 hours. The 51st Highland Division led the assault, with the 7th Battalion Black Watch loaded into DUKWs operated by American crews. Each vehicle carried 12 fully equipped soldiers, plus its 2-man crew. Navigation lights shielded to be visible only from behind marked entry and exit points on both banks. Sergeant Robert McPherson of the Black Watch described the crossing experience. The vehicles rolled down the bank and suddenly were floating. The American driver simply kept driving as if they were still on land, except water now rushed past at considerable speed. Engine noise was tremendous, and shell impacts erupted around them in the darkness and smoke, but visibility was virtually zero. The current proved stronger than expected, 8 to 10 knots in the main channel. DUKWs launched upstream of their intended landing points as drivers calculated drift like aircraft navigators, plotting courses through crosswinds. Some vehicles were swept hundreds of yards downstream, but their ability to drive up any reasonably sloped bank meant they could exit the river wherever circumstances found them. By 2200 hours, the first wave had crossed successfully. German defenders, expecting to hear assault boats returning for additional waves, heard only the continued roar of artillery and the disappearance of the DUKWs into darkness as their passengers already engaged German positions from completely unexpected directions. As dawn broke on March 24th, German commanders began receiving reports that defied rational explanation. Enemy troops were appearing miles inland from the crossing points in battalion-strength formations with heavy weapons and complete supply loads. The expected pattern of gradually expanding bridgeheads simply hadn't materialized. Instead, Allied forces seemed to be everywhere at once, attacking from directions the defensive plan had never anticipated. Hauptmann Karl Reichert, commanding a battery of 88mm guns positioned to cover the crossing site at Rhine, reported to divisional headquarters in confusion and alarm. "Enemy armor is behind us," he reported. "Repeat, enemy armor is now behind our position. How did they manage to cross? All bridges are destroyed. We have observed no pontoon construction. What Reichert had actually encountered weren't tanks, but DUKWs carrying infantry support weapons, mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank guns that had driven directly from the Rhine to positions 3 miles inland. Their amphibious capability allowed them to bypass German strongpoints specifically positioned to defend obvious routes leading from the riverbank. As morning fog lifted, the scale of the operation became horrifyingly apparent. Hundreds of DUKWs were shuttling across the Rhine in continuous streams. Unlike assault boats requiring engineer crews and limited to perpendicular crossings at prepared sites, DUKWs could enter and exit the river wherever banks permitted. German artillery observers reported swimming trucks crossing at dozens of points along a 22-mile front. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, operations officer for the 180th Division, recorded in his war diary what should have been obvious but wasn't. "The enemy has deployed a type of amphibious vehicle in numbers we never anticipated. Our defensive plan assumed 6 to 8 crossing points we could target with concentrated fire. Instead, they are crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot engage so many targets simultaneously." The British Second Army's crossing at Wesel employed a devastating combination of DUKWs and Buffalo LVTs. The 15th Scottish Division crossed in Buffaloes, while DUKWs brought their heavy weapons and supplies. By 0800 hours, despite fierce resistance from the 1st Parachute Army, 3 full divisions were across the Rhine with their complete equipment loads intact. At 1000 hours on March 24th, the thunder of aircraft engines added another layer to the battle's cacophony. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history, commenced as a massive air armada appeared over the Rhine. The operation involved more than 1,700 transport aircraft and over 1,350 gliders carrying 16,000 paratroopers and glider troops. This wasn't the isolated paratroop drop German doctrine expected, but a coordinated hammer blow designed to work in perfect conjunction with the amphibious assault. Obergefreiter Franz Weber of the 84th Infantry Division watched from his defensive position near Hamminkeln as the sky transformed. The sky turned black with aircraft. Parachutes bloomed like flowers across the landscape, thousands upon thousands of them. German soldiers initially thought this was the main assault, and the river crossings were merely diversions. Then they learned the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind their lines with swimming trucks. The airborne forces, the US 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne Divisions, landed within artillery range of the Rhine crossings, something German commanders hadn't anticipated. Previous airborne operations had dropped paratroopers far behind enemy lines, where they operated independently for days or weeks. This time, they landed just 6 miles from the river, directly supporting the amphibious forces. The coordination between airborne and amphibious units multiplied their overall effectiveness exponentially. DUKWs carrying ammunition and medical supplies drove directly to airborne positions that in previous operations would have required either air supply drops or link-up with ground forces days later. Wounded paratroopers were evacuated in DUKWs, returning to the Western Bank, something that would have been impossible in traditional airborne operations. Private First Class Donald Burgert of the 17th Airborne later wrote about the experience. His unit was fighting for a critical crossroads when these peculiar truck boats appeared driving up out of the woods. No splashing, no bogging down, they simply drove like regular trucks, except everyone knew they'd just crossed the Rhine. The crew chief shouted, "Anybody need ammo?" Burgert remembered thinking they were hallucinating. By noon on March 24th, the full implications of the DUKW assault became unmistakably clear to German commanders. This wasn't simply a new method for crossing rivers. It represented a complete revolution in amphibious logistics that invalidated virtually every assumption underlying their entire defensive strategy. Traditional river crossings required sequential phases: assault crossing, bridgehead consolidation, bridge construction, and finally supply build-up. Each phase presented vulnerabilities to counterattack. Once bridges were built, they became critical choke points, concentrating targets for German artillery and air attack. The DUKWs eliminated these vulnerabilities entirely. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, logistics officer for the 16th Corps, had established what he termed DUKW highways across the Rhine. Vehicles loaded on the Western Bank with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel simply drove into the river, crossed, and delivered directly to combat units. The revolution had arrived not through superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but through American industrial innovation, the very thing German intelligence had fatally underestimated. Straight through the riverbank they came. No halting, no switching vehicles, no waiting for spans to go up. Sims reported that they were pushing roughly 50 DUKWs per hour through their crossing point. Each of these workhorses carried either 2.5 tons of supplies or up to 25 servicemen. Do the math on that. 125 tons of supplies or 1,250 troops, every single hour. Around the clock. The Germans were searching desperately for bridges to destroy, but there weren't any to find. Just trucks, ordinary-looking trucks, driving straight through the water like it was a paved road. The impact on German defenders was something they simply weren't prepared for. It was crushing. Feldwebel Hermann Gutz from the 2nd Parachute Regiment made a diary entry that captures their desperation perfectly. "Those Americans have unlimited vehicles that can swim," he wrote. "How in God's name do you stop an army that can turn any river into a highway?" "We destroyed bridges for nothing," German supply people kept saying. They didn't even need the bridges. It was surreal from the German perspective, absolutely surreal. Consider what Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo from the 30th Infantry Division witnessed. He was helping establish a supply dump 3 miles inland from the Rhine, on the German side of things. Then a DUKW comes rolling up out of the water like it was nothing, still dripping wet. Inside were hot meals in insulated containers. The cooks back on the Western Bank had prepared everything, loaded it aboard a duck, and it drove straight across to deliver hot coffee and food in the middle of an active battle. The Germans thought the Americans had gone insane. On the morning of March 25th, German commanders were staring at a situation that no military academy, no doctrine, no strategic planning had ever prepared them for. The Rhine, Germany's legendary protective barrier, had somehow become irrelevant. Not conquered, not breached in the traditional sense, but simply rendered useless by American industrial capability. It was precisely the kind of thing their own intelligence services had dismissed as an American curiosity months earlier. General Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, called his officers together that morning in a farmhouse outside Brunnen. He needed to make sense of what was happening. The captured testimony from those officers reveals how profound their shock really was. According to accounts from those present, Schlemm looked at his gathered commanders and said something that must have felt like a death knell. "Gentlemen, we prepared ourselves to fight the previous war. We expected the enemy to attack our fortress, to strike where we had positioned our defenses. Instead, they simply drove around it." The scale of what was taking place left him struggling for words. The numbers were staggering. Within the first 48 hours, the DUKWs had ferried more than 15,000 troops across the Rhine. But that wasn't even the most critical part. They'd transported over 1,200 vehicles, jeeps, trucks, light armored pieces, all of which would have required weeks to move using conventional crossing methods. And artillery. Gun crews watched as their pieces were being floated across and positioned on the eastern bank, already firing, before German intelligence had even confirmed that crossings were actually taking place. Obersturmbannführer Heinrich von Lüttwitz was commanding what remained of Panzerbrigade 106. He decided he had to counterattack near Wesel on March 25th. His records show he ordered his units toward the river to destroy the enemy bridgehead. What he found was something his training had never addressed. There was no bridgehead in any traditional sense. Enemy forces were spread out across a 15-kilometer front with no central point, no key position to strike. Instead, swimming vehicles were everywhere, continuously pouring reinforcements across at multiple points simultaneously. It was impossible to identify where to attack. The counterattack collapsed with devastating losses. The British were experiencing equal success across their sector. Scottish divisions had advanced 6 miles inland by day's end on March 25th, all of it supported by an endless stream of DUKW supply missions. Even artillery observers were riding in these amphibious vehicles, using their speed and agility to call in fire missions while dodging German counter-battery responses. The Rhine crossing threw into sharp relief something fundamental about industrial warfare: the massive gap between American mass production philosophy and German engineering craftsmanship. The Germans had developed their own amphibious vehicle, the Landwasser Schlepper. In certain technical respects, it was actually superior to the DUKW. It could carry 20 men compared to 25 in the American version, and it had substantially better armor protection. Its tracked design gave it advantages in rough terrain and snow. German engineers had solved genuinely difficult problems: waterproofing track systems, creating reliable bilge pumps. As a piece of engineering, it was genuinely impressive. But Germany had produced only about 100 of them. Far fewer saw any actual combat service. The LWS demanded specialized components, highly skilled craftsmen for assembly, and rare materials for its armor and waterproofing systems. Each one cost roughly 75,000 Reichsmarks. That was 7 times what a DUKW cost. Meanwhile, General Motors had manufactured 21,147 DUKWs. They used standard truck components. They used assembly line production. The brilliance of the American design lay in standardization. The DUKW shared its engine, transmission, axles, and hundreds of other components with the standard CCKW truck, of which over 560,000 had been built. Any mechanic who knew military trucks could service a DUKW. Parts were everywhere. A damaged vehicle got repaired quickly. If something was broken beyond field repair, you could cannibalize pieces from another truck. Master Sergeant Edwin Coleman headed maintenance for the 402nd Amphibious Truck Company. He explained the practical advantage this gave them. "We kept 90% of our ducks running the whole time," he said. "When something failed, we had replacement parts. When we didn't have the exact part, we could improvise something from a regular truck. Try that with some fancy German piece of equipment." The American design philosophy extended well beyond raw production numbers. The DUKW was engineered for simplicity. Any soldier who could operate a truck could learn to drive a DUKW within a few hours. No extensive training. No months of preparation. German vehicles required extensively trained crews. The Americans built their vehicles assuming operators would be civilian soldiers, regular men with minimal military training. German engineers built theirs assuming professional soldiers who'd had months to learn and practice. What happened at the Rhine was seen differently depending on which bank you stood on. For the men crossing, for the men waiting to cross, these weren't abstract statistics or strategic concepts. They were young men watching warfare transform before their eyes in real time. Private First Class James Harris from the 89th Infantry Division remembered his first sight of a DUKW. "We were standing on the west bank, expecting to pile into assault boats like we'd trained for. Getting shot at the whole way, probably. Then these things roll down the slope, They look like boats, except they've got wheels. A Navy guy, Navy, out here in Germany, waves us aboard. What the hell is this thing? Harris asked. The sailor grinned at him. Your taxi to Berlin, soldier. The sheer fact of seeing Navy personnel operating DUKWs in continental Europe added to the German confusion. It didn't match anything in their experience. Seaman Second Class Robert Muti was assigned to a naval detachment operating these vehicles during the crossing. He remembered capturing some German soldiers who just stood staring at his Navy uniform, unable to process what they were seeing. One German who spoke English kept asking the same question over and over. How is the American Navy here? The ocean is 300 miles away. He couldn't make sense of what was happening. German accounts show escalating despair as the scope of American amphibious capability became undeniable. Lieutenant Friedrich Schulze of the 338th Infantry Division wrote a letter after his unit surrendered. It captures the helplessness. They came across the river like it was a street, he wrote, not sneaking, not rushing between artillery barrages, just driving, trucks full of soldiers, driving through the Rhine. We fired at them, but more kept coming, always more. Where did they find so many? Unteroffizier Paul Braun was captured on March 26th. During interrogation, he tried to explain the disconnect between what they'd been told and what was actually happening. We were told the Rhine would stop you for weeks, he said. That you'd have to build bridges and we'd destroy them. That your assault boats would be easy targets. Nobody told us about swimming trucks. Nobody warned us you could cross anywhere, anytime. We prepared for the wrong war. By March 26th, just 72 hours after the first DUKW entered the Rhine, the German defensive position had essentially ceased to exist. What Wehrmacht doctrine insisted would consume weeks had been accomplished in 3 days. The Rhine barrier, the thing that propaganda had promised would hold until the Reich could negotiate from strength, had simply vanished. 3 days of operations produced stunning numbers. The DUKWs completed over 5,000 individual crossings. They moved 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of supplies. They evacuated 2,000 wounded. Traditional bridging operations would have required 2 weeks minimum to achieve that same volume. And all the while, they'd have been under constant attack. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, often criticized for his caution and methodical approach, had achieved something unexpected through this massive amphibious vehicle employment. Complete operational surprise. His after-action report made the point with elegant simplicity. The enemy expected us to cross the Rhine, he wrote. They did not expect us to drive across it. That distinction, he concluded, proved fatal to their defense. General Dwight Eisenhower toured the crossing sites on March 26th. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded what happened when the Supreme Commander watched the endless flow of DUKWs moving back and forth. Eisenhower watched them stream across, and he turned to Omar Bradley. With these things, he said, every river in Germany is now a highway. Bradley nodded slowly. The Germans are just now figuring that out, he replied. The psychological destruction was complete. Joseph Goebbels made a diary entry for March 26th that reads almost like an admission of defeat. The situation in the West has become impossible, he wrote. The enemy has crossed the Rhine along a broad front, using a new type of amphibious vehicle we completely failed to anticipate. Our last natural barrier is gone. The war is lost. March 27th brought the full explosive exploitation of what the Rhine breakthrough had made possible. With German forces in complete disorder, Allied commanders unleashed their mobile forces without restraint. The DUKWs, having accomplished their primary amphibious mission, now revealed another unexpected capability. They could keep functioning as regular trucks. They could advance right alongside the armored spearheads. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, had been ferried across in record time. Tank crews experienced something surreal. They followed behind DUKWs that had literally just come out of the Rhine, still streaming water, racing down German roads toward their objectives. The amphibious vehicles carried fuel and ammunition directly to the advancing tank units. The traditional pause after a river crossing, the pause while engineers built bridges and supplies accumulated, that didn't exist anymore. Major General Isaac D. White commanded the 2nd Armored. His report captured the change in operational tempo. "We advanced 50 miles on March 27th alone," he stated. "In any previous operation, we would have been immobilized waiting for bridges and supply stockpiles. Instead, the DUKWs matched our speed. They crossed rivers in our path, located new crossing points, and had supply stations established before our main force even arrived. German resistance disintegrated into isolated pockets. Units that had positioned themselves to hit Allied bridgeheads discovered those bridgeheads didn't exist in any recognizable form. Allied forces seemed to be everywhere simultaneously, bypassing prepared positions, appearing where they weren't expected. The rigid German defensive doctrine, centered on identifying and destroying fixed crossing points, had no answer for hundreds of amphibious vehicles that could create crossing points anywhere they wanted. Oberst Hans von Luck, one of Germany's most experienced armored commanders, ran into American forces near Dorsten on March 28th. His post-war memoir captures his realization. His battalion was racing to set up a blocking position when they encountered American troops already dug in and organized. He questioned a captured American lieutenant about how they'd managed to move so quickly. The lieutenant gestured toward a line of those amphibious trucks. "We don't wait for bridges," the American said simply. Von Luck understood in that moment something far more significant than any single battle. "We had lost more than a battle," he wrote later. "We had lost an entire form of warfare." The broader impact of the DUKW on the Rhine crossing extended far beyond the impressive-sounding statistics of vehicles and supplies transported. These amphibious trucks had fundamentally altered the mathematics of river assault. The advantages they created multiplied and reinforced one another in ways traditional operations couldn't match. Conventional river crossings concentrated forces at specific locations, creating concentrated targets for artillery and air defense. The DUKWs dispersed crossings across the entire front, diluting German firepower across a much broader area. Wehrmacht doctrine called for counter-attacking bridgeheads before they could consolidate and expand. But there were no traditional bridgeheads to attack, just a continuous flow of infiltration across a wide front that had no clear center. Colonel William Thompson commanded DUKW operations for the 9th Army. He did the calculations on time savings. Building a heavy pontoon bridge under fire took minimum 12 to 24 hours. During that time, you could reinforce the crossing with assault boats, maybe a company per hour if you were lucky. "We were moving a full battalion per hour with DUKWs from minute one," he explained. The medical dimension was profound, though often overlooked. Captain Dorothy Anderson worked as a nurse with the 45th Field Hospital. The evacuation system transformed what had been possible before. Wounded soldiers got loaded into DUKWs on the eastern bank and driven directly back to our hospital on the western side, she described it. No vehicle transfers, no waiting for bridges. We were getting casualties to surgery within an hour of being wounded. That was simply impossible with traditional river crossing methods. The DUKWs enabled tactical innovations that traditional crossings never could have supported. Artillery-forward observers could relocate rapidly across the water in these vehicles, making German counter-battery fire ineffective. Combat engineers used DUKWs to transport bridge sections, which actually accelerated traditional bridge construction, even as it made those bridges less operationally critical. Radio relay stations mounted in DUKWs maintained communications across the water barrier. The entire communications network stayed intact. Post-war analysis exposed the serious gaps in German intelligence regarding American amphibious capabilities. The Wehrmacht had observed DUKWs in Sicily, at Salerno, at Anzio, at Normandy. Yet they never grasped the strategic implications these vehicles held for river-crossing operations. General Major Reinhard Gehlen, who served as Chief of Foreign Armies East and later founded West German intelligence, later admitted in his memoirs how their thinking had failed. "We catalogued American equipment with meticulous detail," Gehlen wrote. "We knew about the DUKW, we simply never imagined they would mass hundreds of them for a single river-crossing operation. Our thinking was constrained by our own limitations. Because we could only produce a handful of amphibious vehicles, we assumed the Americans faced similar constraints." Captured German intelligence files revealed systematic miscalculation. An Army Group H assessment from February 1945 estimated that Allied forces possessed approximately 100 to 150 amphibious vehicles suitable for river operations. They were off by roughly 150. The true total across the 21st Army Group exceeded 2,000 vehicles. Yet military planners had already dismissed these amphibious trucks, viewing them as workable only for supply runs once beaches fell under Allied control, not as assault tools themselves. The failure ran much deeper than these figures suggest. German intelligence proved utterly blind to what was coming. They never spotted the specialized amphibious truck companies, never caught wind of their training exercises on the river, never grasped that an entire tactical revolution was unfolding right before their eyes. The Germans prepared to defend against the kind of river crossing they expected to face, not the one about to crash down upon them. Major Joachim Engelmann, who served as intelligence officer for the 1st Parachute Army, spoke candidly after being captured. "We studied every Allied river crossing from the Rapido onwards. We thought we understood their methods completely. The massed use of amphibious vehicles simply never factored into our calculations. It seemed," he explained, "as though the Allies had somehow gained the power to drive tanks straight across the water, something that fell entirely outside German military thinking." And while the tactical and technological advantages shown at the Rhine did prove decisive, the crossing carried a heavy human price. Though casualties ran far lower than traditional assault methods would have inflicted, the toll remained sobering nonetheless. The combined losses from Operations Plunder and Varsity reached 6,781 soldiers, 3,168 from British and Commonwealth forces, 2,813 American personnel. Airborne troops paid especially dearly, caught in a hail of anti-aircraft fire, with some planes shot down before paratroopers could even jump. The 17th Airborne Division took 430 men killed in action on that single day alone. German artillery claimed several DUKWs as they evacuated wounded from the battlefield, swallowing every soul aboard. Oskar Friedensen, a combat engineer serving with the 89th Infantry Division, was there at St. Gorshausen on March 26 and recounted what those crossing attempts actually cost. "We lost 250 of our 420 men trying to secure our sector. The DUKWs moved us across that river fast enough, sure, but the Germans had dug into high ground with machine guns and mortars waiting. Being quick doesn't stop a bullet." The damage inflicted on German forces proved catastrophic by comparison. The 1st Parachute Army effectively disintegrated as a cohesive fighting force. Within 72 hours, the Allies had netted over 16,000 prisoners, many of whom simply abandoned their positions the moment they realized the Rhine barrier had collapsed. Entire German units found themselves surrounded as DUKW transported American forces materialized behind their lines. Gefreiter Werner Hoffmann of the 84th Infantry Division fell into captivity on March 25, and his interrogation exposed the crushing psychological blow the crossing dealt. "We held our positions for 2 days, firing at the crossing sites. Then Americans emerged from behind us. When we asked the prisoners how they'd crossed, they pointed to those swimming trucks. Our lieutenant dropped his weapon," Hoffmann continued, "and said if they can drive trucks across the Rhine, the war is finished." Nobody argued the point. One of the most striking moments of the entire Rhine operation occurred on March 25, when Prime Minister Winston Churchill made the controversial decision to personally cross the river. This was no minor matter for Churchill. He grasped the historical weight of what was happening, the symbolic power of Western armies setting foot on the east bank of Germany's most famous river. Churchill, accompanied by Field Marshal Montgomery and General Alan Brooke, first surveyed the crossing sites from atop a destroyed railway bridge near Wesel. Then, brushing aside both his security team's panicked objections and Eisenhower's direct orders not to go, Churchill climbed aboard an American LCVP, a landing craft designed for personnel transport, and headed for the eastern bank. Montgomery's aide, Lieutenant Colonel Trumbull Warren, recorded the scene with obvious awe. The PM was absolutely resolved. He kept saying, "I must cross the Rhine. I've waited years for this moment." The American crew was absolutely horrified when they understood who they'd just loaded aboard. But Churchill was already settled in, with a cigar clenched between his teeth, making victory signs. For half an hour, the British Prime Minister walked on German soil east of the Rhine, while German artillery rounds exploded nearby, spraying the group with dirt and stone fragments. Churchill stooped down, scooped a handful of earth into his palm, and remarked quietly, "German soil. At last." The crossing served no military purpose and exposed him to considerable danger, yet it carried immense psychological weight. Britain's leader standing victorious on conquered German territory. The amphibious assault method made Churchill's symbolic gesture feasible in ways traditional engineering could never have managed. Under normal bridging operations, such a crossing would have required closing down the entire military supply line across a vital bridge. The distributed system using amphibious vehicles allowed Churchill's theatrical moment to unfold without interrupting the flow of troops and equipment. The Rhine crossing's success shortened the European war by an estimated 3 weeks, based on post-war analysis conducted by the US Strategic Bombing Survey. But this acceleration stemmed not merely from crossing the river, rather from how quickly and broadly the operation unfolded thanks to amphibious vehicle deployment. Conventional river crossing doctrine demanded a sequential process: establish small beachheads, construct bridges while under fire, bring in reinforcements gradually, then mount a breakout after stockpiling supplies. Even executed flawlessly, such operations consumed 2 to 3 weeks minimum. The Germans would have found time to build new defensive positions, demolish infrastructure, and potentially negotiate terms. Instead, the Allies accomplished in 72 hours what German planners had assumed would consume weeks. By March 26th, 3 entire Allied army groups were driving deep into German territory. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial core, sat encircled by April 1st. The sheer speed prevented Germans from destroying factories, bridges, and supply depots that might otherwise have sustained their resistance far longer. General Omar Bradley reflected on the human stakes. If we'd been forced to cross using traditional assault boats, engineers constructing bridges under fire, gradual reinforcement, we'd have buried 50,000 men minimum. The DUKWs transformed what should have been a bloodbath into a logistics problem. The reverberations extended eastward. Soviet commanders, observing the Rhine crossing success, pressed their own operations harder toward Berlin, fearing Western forces might seize the Nazi capital first. The competition between East and West that would define post-war Europe gained new urgency from the DUKW's triumph at the Rhine. By March 28, 1945, the German command structure in the West had essentially ceased functioning. Communications between units collapsed as headquarters fell back or faced encirclement. The speed of the Allied push, unleashed by the Rhine crossing's success, prevented any coherent defensive reorganization. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, found his forces fractured and trapped in the Ruhr pocket. The orders he issued on March 29th laid bare his despair. The enemy has achieved the impossible at the Rhine. Further resistance only multiplies suffering. I release all soldiers from their oath. Preserve yourselves however you must. Model took his own life on April 21st rather than surrender to captors. The collapse was spiritual, not just tactical. Wehrmacht soldiers, who had fought block by block through German villages, now surrendered in massive groups. The Rhine carried profound symbolic weight. Its breaching meant the war was genuinely finished. Units that might have attempted guerrilla resistance simply scattered and vanished. Public morale, already shattered by years of bombing campaigns, simply evaporated. The Rhine crossing proved that no natural obstacle could shield Germany. If the Rhine fell in 3 days, what purpose did continued fighting serve? Mayors and local administrators began handing over their towns peacefully to prevent destruction. Hans Frank, the Nazi Governor-General of Poland, confided his thoughts to his diary. The Rhine is crossed. The sacred river protecting Germany for 2,000 years has fallen in 72 hours. If anyone harbored doubt about our fate, that doubt is gone. We face annihilation, not defeat. The Rhine crossing transformed military doctrine about amphibious operations fundamentally. Before March 1945, amphibious assault meant primarily seaborne invasions. Normandy, Pacific Island campaigns. The Rhine showed that amphibious capabilities proved equally powerful in continental warfare. The US Army's official history offered this assessment. The mass employment of DUKWs at the Rhine represents a revolution in military affairs equivalent to armor's introduction in the First World War. The power to treat water as a thoroughfare, rather than a barrier, restructures operational thinking entirely. Soviet observers stationed at Allied headquarters watched carefully and took extensive notes. Colonel Ivan Yakashin dispatched his report to Moscow. The Americans have resolved river crossing through industrial mass manufacture. They constructed amphibious vehicles in such quantities that rivers became irrelevant. This concept carries profound implications for any European conflict. The British Army, despite full participation in the operation, commissioned exhaustive studies. Brigadier Richard Goodbody concluded, "We cannot again suppose that water barriers offer meaningful defense against an enemy possessing adequate amphibious capabilities." The Rhine proved industrial might supersedes geographic advantage. Though commanders readily seized credit for the crossing's triumph, the genuine heroes were the DUKW crews making it all possible. Many came from Navy detachments, finding themselves in the middle of Germany, commanding what amounted to floating targets. Seaman First Class Joseph Bernardini from Naval Unit 350 described the experience candidly. "You're steering this enormous, sluggish target across 1,300 feet of exposed water. German 88s are shooting at you, mortars exploding around you, machine gun fire searching for the range. You cannot weave much, or the current carries you off course. You grip the wheel, push the throttle forward, and pray. That is all you can do." Maintenance crews performed near miraculous feats, keeping DUKWs running. Working under fire, frequently in darkness, they sealed hull breaches, replaced propellers shattered by shrapnel, and kept engines operating despite constant saturation from rainwater and river spray. Master Sergeant Thomas Riley from the 458 Amphibious Truck Company's maintenance section explained their methods. "We patched holes using whatever came to hand. Ration cans hammered flat, scraps of German armor plating, even wooden dowels. Anything that held water and kept moving, we maintained it." British DUKW operators trained by Americans developed their own adaptations. Sergeant Major William Davies of the Royal Army Service Corps created a method using DUKWs to extract tank crews from burning vehicles. "We'd drive right up to burning tanks, position ourselves as a shield, and pull wounded tankers aboard. The water streaming from our hull helped with the heat, saved many lives that way." After the war's conclusion, German military specialists dissected their defeat exhaustively. The Rhine crossing featured prominently in these post-mortems as fundamentally a failure of imagination as much as material. General Franz Halder, formerly Chief of the General Staff, reflected in 1948, "We readied thoroughly for the Allied Rhine crossing. We positioned reserves, registered artillery, prepared demolitions. We executed everything our doctrine demanded. We simply never conceived the enemy would possess hundreds of vehicles capable of ignoring the river's existence entirely." The Wehrmacht's final operational review, completed by imprisoned German officers in 1946, admitted, "The American deployment of amphibious vehicles in mass quantity represents a form of warfare neither anticipated nor countered with available resources. Even possessing advanced knowledge, German industry lacked capacity to produce comparable numbers." The Rhine crossing was decided in Detroit's factories, not along the Rhine's banks, the report concluded. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored tactics, perhaps offered the most penetrating insight. "We Germans perfected the craft of warfare. The Americans perfected warfare as business. At the Rhine, business defeated craft. Their swimming trucks lacked elegance or sophistication, but they existed in overwhelming numbers and functioned effectively." That represents the American approach to warfare. Despite its decisive strategic impact, the DUKW's contribution to the Rhine crossing has been largely overshadowed by more dramatic episodes: the controversial Remagen Bridge seizure, the massive airborne operations, Montgomery's set-piece strategies. Yet those who survived understood what truly mattered. General Dwight Eisenhower wrote in his memoir Crusade in Europe, "Scholars will debate what ended the war most decisively, strategic bombing, Soviet advances, or Allied unity. I suspect historians underestimate the humble DUKW. Without it, the Rhine would have become a graveyard. With it, we advanced through Germany almost as tourists on an excursion." DUKWs continued serving well past the Rhine. They forded the Elbe, the Danube, and countless lesser rivers. They rescued concentration camp survivors too weakened to walk. They delivered food to starving civilians in territories cut off by fighting. These vessels that shattered Germany's final barrier became instruments of mercy and reconstruction. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison from the 336th Amphibious Truck Company recalled operations after Germany surrendered. The same vehicle that crossed the Rhine under artillery fire was now delivering food to German children in flooded regions near Hamburg. Kids had never seen anything comparable. A truck that could swim, they'd chase alongside us hollering, "Schwimmwagen, Schwimmwagen." It was strange, really. Something built for killing ended up saving lives instead. The 21,047 DUKWs manufactured during the war embodied American industrial philosophy. While German engineers obsessed over perfection in limited quantities, American factories prioritized adequacy in overwhelming abundance. This principle extended far beyond amphibious trucks. The same manufacturing plants producing DUKWs manufactured 2.5-ton cargo trucks at 10,000 monthly. Mills rolling DUKW hulls launched Liberty ships every 42 hours. Engine plants shifted fluidly between truck, aircraft, and tank engines, with minimal production interruption. Donald Nelson, chairman of the War Production Board, toured a DUKW assembly line during 1944 and grasped the philosophical gulf between American and German approaches to industrial warfare. He stood watching them work, and in just 60 minutes, those men completed work on 60 UKW amphibious vehicles. Not one of them would pass inspection by German standards. The welds were rough, the engineering solutions straightforward, the paint a dull olive drab. Yet each imperfect machine would successfully cross that river. German factories took an entire month to produce a single flawless amphibious craft. American workers assembled 180 serviceable vehicles in that same span of time. When compared side by side, the German Schlepper revealed the fundamental weakness of handcrafted production methods. Every LWS demanded highly trained specialists, custom-built components, and rigorous testing protocols. Once Allied bombing disrupted the supply network, manufacturing ground to a halt completely. A single missing part meant no vehicle could be finished. American DUKW production worked differently. When components became unavailable, workers substituted alternatives and kept right on building. The Rhine crossing success sent shockwaves through the final stages of the war. German commanders across the entire Reich learned what had happened. The Western Allies crossed the Rhine in mere hours, moving supplies and soldiers across what should have been an impenetrable barrier. Morale, already fragile, shattered entirely. Down in Italy, German units holding mountain strongholds for months suddenly withdrew without warning. Field Marshal Kesselring made his report clear. The crossing of the Rhine caused immediate, severe deterioration in troop morale. Soldiers whispered the same question over and over. If the Rhine cannot stop them, what possibly can? No officer had an answer. German forces scattered across Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, still dangerous but now isolated, began negotiating surrender terms with local commanders. The belief in an impregnable Rhine had kept hope alive for a negotiated settlement. When that barrier fell in just 72 hours, further resistance seemed utterly pointless. Even in Berlin, surrounded by Soviet guns, the Rhine crossing had its effect. Hitler held his final military conference on April 27th, and in that meeting he voiced his regret. The Rhine was lost because we failed to anticipate their amphibious capabilities. We prepared to fight yesterday's war. Looking back, it was perhaps his only truthful military assessment during the entire conflict. Decades later, in 1985, surviving veterans gathered in Lexington, Kentucky for a reunion. These graying soldiers had lived through those 3 extraordinary days that ended Nazi Germany's final hope. Several preserved DUKWs sat on display, drawing crowds of visitors. Sergeant James Mitchell, now retired, had commanded a DUKW with the 819th Amphibious Truck Company. He stood beside one of the old vehicles, weathered and worn. Ugly thing, isn't it? Like someone crossed a boat with a truck and got something that's neither one nor the other. But this ugly duckling swam the Rhine when the Nazis said it couldn't be done. We didn't win because we fought better. We won because we made more things, we thought differently, we imagined what they couldn't imagine. Hans Müller was also there that day. He had been an Obergefreiter defending the Rhine with the 180th Infantry Division. The German military had invited him as a guest to speak with the American veterans. His words carried weight and meaning. You brought swimming trucks to a river battle. We brought anti-tank guns to stop those trucks. When I first watched those vehicles emerge from the Rhine, I understood everything. The war was finished, not lost, finished. You cannot defeat an enemy who transforms your greatest strength into a simple road. The gathering revealed something fundamental and true. The Rhine crossing succeeded not because of superior bravery or brilliant tactics, but because of American industrial strength channeled through ingenuity. The real heroes worked as much on assembly lines in Pontiac as the soldiers fought in Germany. The operation between March 23rd and 26th, 1945, represented far more than successful military tactics. It showed the supremacy of American industrial democracy against German military aristocracy, mass production against craft perfection, practical innovation against fixed military thinking. The DUKW itself perfectly captured this American spirit. It wasn't the best amphibious vehicle that could have been designed, but rather the best that could be manufactured rapidly using existing technology. It conquered problems through numbers rather than excellence, through uniform parts rather than custom engineering. It was piloted by civilian soldiers with minimal training rather than career officers with decades of experience. Professional German military men found this approach deeply troubling. General von Rundstedt, held in British captivity, spoke his mind. War has turned into a factory manager's job instead of a general's craft. Your swimming trucks were not truly weapons, but manufactured goods. You triumphed not where soldiers fight, but where items are made. Yet this shift was precisely what mattered. America had applied industrial logic to combat itself. The DUKW symbolized more than military hardware. It embodied industrial philosophy, the conviction that any obstacle could be overcome through sufficient, well-organized production. When accountants tallied up the Rhine crossing results, the DUKW's crucial role became undeniable. Vehicles participating, hundreds of DUKWs participated in crossing operations. 600 British Buffalo LVTs provided support. Over 2,000 DUKWs were available throughout the theatre. Roughly 100 German LWS vehicles were built. Few actually functioned. What was accomplished? Between March 23rd and 31st, 1945, 15,000 and more troops transported across. 1,200 vehicles moved forward. 3,000 tons of supplies delivered. 2,000 wounded soldiers evacuated. 5,100 individual DUKW trips completed. Manufacturing totals: 21,147 DUKWs manufactured by America. 562,750 standard trucks used DUKW components. Germany produced approximately 100 LWS vehicles. 0 German vehicles were specifically engineered for river crossing. Speed of production: 38 days from DUKW idea to working prototype, 72 hours to breach Rhine defenses, 3 weeks of fighting compressed by the rapid crossing, 50,000 and more estimated Allied casualties prevented. Dollar amounts: $10,750 per DUKW, 670,000 Reichsmarks per LWS, a 71-to-1 cost advantage for American production. Deployment advantage was infinite. The Rhine crossing's impact extended far beyond immediate battle results. It proved that technological advantage could come not from secret weapons, but through massive deployment of tools the enemy dismissed as trivial. Military planners after the war absorbed the Rhine lessons. Cold War NATO strategy emphasized amphibious vehicles for crossing the many rivers of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union created multiple amphibious vehicle designs, studying American achievements. Contemporary militaries now view river crossing capacity as essential rather than specialized. The crossing also vindicated American production methods. Numbers mattered more than perfection when you had enough numbers. Availability trumped flawlessness. Dependability outweighed complexity. These ideas transformed American industry far beyond weapons manufacturing. The Marshall Plan rebuilding Europe borrowed DUKW philosophy. Massive standardized assistance rather than custom solutions. The interstate highway system applied military supply methods to highways and roads. The space program used reliable mass-produced parts instead of custom-built perfection. Perhaps the DUKW's most powerful contribution was psychological. German troops and citizens watched American forces treat the venerated Rhine like an insignificant stream. This matter-of-fact display of industrial power did more to demonstrate Germany's inevitable defeat than propaganda ever could. After the war, Germans who lived through it shared similar recollections. They believed Americans would get stopped at the Rhine for months, time for wonder weapons or peace talks. Instead, Americans crossed in 3 days, using vehicles Germans didn't realize existed in such quantities. The shock remained profound. Elizabeth Becker lived close to the crossing. We heard bombardment on March 23rd, explosions and thunder throughout that night. We expected weeks of fighting. By March 26th, American vehicles were driving right past us, dripping wet from the crossing. My father had fought in the earlier war and watched them pass. When your enemy can drive vehicles across rivers like roads, he told me, the war is over. He spoke the truth. This psychological collapse hastened German recognition of defeat and foreign occupation. Uprisings that might have formed never happened. Witnessing American industrial capability at the Rhine convinced Germans that fighting back was pointless. Not because of battlefield losses, but because their weapons were outdated. Churchill, who personally crossed the Rhine during the operation, wrote about it in his memoirs with genuine eloquence. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 meant more than breaching Germany's final natural barrier. It displayed a revolutionary form of fighting. The Americans with their swimming trucks had answered through production what we Europeans tried to solve through military strategy. They didn't assault the Rhine, they went around it. I watched those peculiar machines, half-boat, half-tracked, wholly successful, streaming across water that had sheltered Germany from conquest since the Roman era. Each DUKW carried not simply soldiers, but a message of doom for Nazi Germany, proof incarnate of American industrial capability. Throughout my years, I have observed many military breakthroughs, the machine gun, the tank, the airplane. But those humble vehicles at the Rhine impressed me more than any of them. They showed not military brilliance, but organizational mastery. Not German perfectionism, but American common sense. Standing on the eastern bank of the Rhine on March 25, 1945, seeing DUKWs rise from the water like creatures from primordial times, I grasped the enormity of what I witnessed. This was not simply war's conclusion, but the beginning of American dominance. May 7, 1945 arrived just 6 weeks after the Rhine crossing. General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender document in Reims. He included in his reasoning the enemy's unforeseen amphibious capabilities at the Rhine. This acknowledgement, though buried within discussion of bombing and Soviet advances, revealed how much the crossing had mattered. General Eisenhower's final report as Supreme Commander gave substantial recognition to the DUKW. No single piece of equipment did more to bring about Germany's rapid defeat than the amphibious truck. It changed rivers into routes, turned supply problems into advantages, shortened the conflict by weeks or perhaps months. The final operational DUKW crossing occurred on May 10, 1945, 2 days following Germany's surrender. This time the cargo wasn't soldiers but food provisions for German civilians trapped in areas where bridges had been destroyed. The vehicle that had broken Germany's final military defense became an instrument of mercy. Private First Class Anthony Demico drove that last DUKW across the Rhine and remembered it simply. No fighting, no weapons, just driving across like any ordinary trip. German children waited on the far bank, hoping for chocolate. Just months before, their fathers would have killed us. Now we were bringing food. That's what those amphibious trucks accomplished. Making the unthinkable routine, transforming enemies into neighbors requiring assistance. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 constitutes a crucial turning point in warfare history, not merely for tactical achievement or strategic weight, but for its meaning regarding how warfare itself was changing. The DUKW, clumsy, defenseless, unremarkable, transformed an obstacle that had safeguarded Germany for 2,000 years into something irrelevant. German commanders prepared for every possibility their military thinking could produce, yet never entertained that American industry could generate 21,000 of these vehicles, making rivers unimportant. They equipped themselves for a different conflict, not through failure of ability, but through inability to conceive American manufacturing. The Rhine wasn't militarily conquered. It became industrially obsolete. The hundreds of DUKWs that traversed the Rhine between March 23rd and 31st, 1945, transported far more than fighting men and cargo. They demonstrated that American mass manufacturing could overturn basic assumptions about warfare. Every German soldier watching a DUKW climb from the Rhine's eastern bank witnessed the collapse of traditional military constraints. Field Marshal Montgomery captured the operation's essence with uncharacteristic conciseness. We didn't assault the Rhine, we drove across it. Converting the extraordinary into routine, the supposedly impossible into procedure, constituted the DUKW's authentic accomplishment. The Rhine crossing proved that modern war's outcome depended on industrial production, properly applied could accomplish what military strategy independently could not. The Wehrmacht, possibly history's most skilled military organization, fell not to superior tactics or strategy, but to vehicles manufactured on Detroit assembly lines that could drive through water. German officers had been correct in earlier assessments. The Rhine couldn't be crossed by force using conventional approaches. They simply never imagined American industry would render conventional methods pointless. Those DUKWs crossing the Rhine in March 1945 carried passengers and supplies, certainly. But they also transported the future of armed conflict, where manufacturing dominance would overcome geographic barriers, where factory output would surpass handmade excellence, where practical solutions would conquer military doctrine. The Rhine crossing's fundamental lesson transcended military strategy. In 20th century total conflict, factories produced victory more reliably than generals. German defenders never comprehended that Americans possessed amphibious trucks capable of crossing the Rhine, not because of military intelligence gaps, but because they couldn't fathom such abundance. This inability of imagination, more than any battlefield miscalculation, sealed the Third Reich's fate at Germany's historic river.